Good morning, everyone. My name's Deb Fuster. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Victorian Council of Social Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, our information forum this morning. I want to start by saying that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, the Kulin Nation this morning. I'm in Melbourne, in the CBD at the VCOSS office, and I want to pay my respects to elders and ancestors and to any First Nations people on the call today. Before I get started with some opening comments, I know that we have people dialing in from all across Australia, and for some of you, this might be your first time that you've heard of VCOSS. So I might just quickly give a little bit of a heads up about who we are and what we do. So we're a peak body for the community services sector here in Victoria. We are part of a national network of councils of social service who are dispersed across right across Australia in every jurisdiction. And our kind of core purpose really, as well as representing social and community services organisations, is actually thinking about the why. Why do these organisations exist? Why do these sectors exist? Why does this sector exist? And it exists to, alleviate poverty and disadvantage in the community. As a peak body, as a social advocacy organisation, what we're really interested in is getting down to the root causes of poverty and disadvantage. So what drives demand for social and community services, and through a number of mechanisms, through research, through policy development, systemic advocacy, coalitions for change, we seek to really kind of shift the dial on those issues. One of the things that is an enduring feature of VCOSS's work is around ensuring that people have access to essential services. So if we look at energy, that people have access to energy that's affordable and energy that's clean as well. So bringing those two things together in terms of equity, in just transitions, and so forth. So it's a very enduring part of VCOSS's policy and advocacy work, and is currently the focus of quite a bit of research that we're doing at the moment as well. So we know that energy increases in energy prices have rapidly outpaced both wage growth and income support payments, and recent rises in the cost of living have made energy hardship even more intense and widespread. So this webinar that we're doing today is part of a 2-year project that we're undertaking that really seeks to look at how we can kind of break the energy hardship nexus and the health hardship nexus, because we know that the two are inextricably linked. So it's a 2-year project that is very generously funded by great colleagues, Energy Consumers Australia. The project is looking at creating new systemic connections to tackle energy poverty from a new direction. So as part of this project, we are exploring broader solutions or bolder solutions to tackle inequity in access to energy. And so that's why we have our colleague here, Bjorn, speaking with us today. Bjorn is Senior Research Fellow at the Australian National University, very eminent ACT Emerging Scientist of the Year, has a PhD in theoretical physics, and also so many strings to the bow, author of Amy's Balancing Act, a children's story on clean energy. So it's my pleasure to welcome Bjorn Sternberg as our expert guest speaker today, our subject matter expert, who is going to talk about this idea of energy as a basic right, which is getting kind of a lot of momentum, I know, in community services kind of circles. And we're kind of really keen to keep kind of building momentum around this conversation. So I'm going to hand over to Bjorn to start speaking in a moment. What we will do is, after Bjorn's presentation, we'll also have a member of the VCOSS team, Rory Anderson, our Energy Policy Advisor, will also be doing a complimentary presentation to Bjorn's. Then we're going to have a Q&A in which you can put questions both to Bjorn and to Rory, the VCOSS team. I'll give you a heads up now. So, as you're listening to the presentations, feel free to start putting questions to our speakers. You're asked to put those questions into the Q&A box throughout your Bjorn and Rory's presentations. And one of my colleagues, Emma Halloran, who's our project coordinator for our Breaking the Energy Health Hardship Nexus project, has also said let's encourage the use of emojis through the session as well. So feel free to use emojis. but start putting those questions into the Q&A box as you're listening to our speakers today. So I'm now going to hand over to Bjorn, who's going to speak about what energy Australians deserve a basic energy right. So thank you, Bjorn.
Thank you. Let me see if I can now share screen. All right, let me know if that isn't working for anyone. So I've slightly modified the title, What Price for Equity? And hopefully you can see a contradiction in that. So let me, also add my, pay my respects to the First Nations people of this beautiful and unceded country here in the ACT, that are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. So I never do this normally. It's normally taken for granted as an academic, but I really wanted to emphasize this morning that all views here are my own, and no one else is to blame for that. So you can try and limit the amount of defenestration that goes on. And also that following, kind of very much aligned with the great work of VCOSS and the Energy Health Nexus project, these ideas that I'm going to be presenting are, I feel, definitely outside of the Overton window, but are hopefully close to the edge of that window, and hopefully we can bring them inside. So that said, any ideas that do resonate with you, credit for those definitely has to be shared with my colleagues at ANU, particularly those working in social science and those working with First Nations people who have been really influential on my thinking for this. So as mentioned, the catalyst for this presentation really comes from this essay that I wrote in the Australian Quarterly about a year ago, really, was when it was written. And going back to that essay, I actually look on it quite favorably, which is a nice surprise. And so I thought I wouldn't spend too much time in this presentation kind of rehashing that. Instead, I really want to focus on an extension of it and some ideas around implementation of it. So I'll just summarize it to say that the basic argument of that essay is that inequality is a choice. And that particularly is at the forefront for me, because I feel that there's this catchphrase in the energy circles that I have been in for a decade, that the energy transition will be distributed, it'll be digitized, it'll be decarbonized, and I agree with all of those. But then I think that erroneously there's another alliteration, but there's an assumption that those three things will lead to it also being democratized. And I think there's a sense of inevitability or technology leading us to that outcome that I think is misplaced. And so I really want to emphasize that the level of inequality that we have and we put up with in our society it's a choice. The second thread of the argument is that markets are really antithetical to equity. That's not saying that markets are a bad thing, but it's acknowledging that markets are a tool for price discovery. So really, they're a tool, and they're a tool for us to determine how to use, and no one tool is suitable for all tasks. So in contrast to trying to efficiently discover prices in a market, equity inherently involves an unequal distribution of resources and rights. And so the way that we've been going about kind of within the Overton window, pursuing equity, I feel is often caught up in the shackles of market thinking. And I think that that's just inherently and inescapably not going to work. Now, more recently, this isn't emphasized in the essay, but I think is a really great point. There's this thing called the Tinbergen rule, Tinbergen being a Nobel Prize winner, no less. And the rule states that for every policy goal that you have, needs its own policy instrument. And so that's something that actually has given a lot of structure to how I now think about these things and how I'll be presenting them. And lastly, there's just a link there to where you can read the original essay. So the outline for today is I want to briefly talk about some of the unique problems of inequality in the energy sector. And then I really want to focus most of my time on a proposal for two policy instruments with which to achieve the two policy goals that I believe we have. Those goals being efficiency, like I do actually really care about efficiency, both because it reduces the total economic cost for all consumers, which is the cost that then needs to be distributed. But also to me, efficiency is very, very important because it relates to reducing the ecological costs of the energy system. If we dig up and build lots of infrastructure, say particularly batteries that I have spent a lot of time working on, and we don't use them, then that's really wasteful, and that's kind of the worst of all outcomes. The second goal that I care for greatly, and I think many of us on the call do, is that we want a certain level of equity within our society, because that equity is foundational to human well-being, both at an individual and at a collective level. And then I'm by no means a kind of political strategist, so I'll just have one slide at the end on what I see going on in the political landscape that are hindrances and also enablers for change. So the problem of inequality has been really well kind of introduced by Deb in the introduction. You all working in this space see this much more than I do in my privileged kind of ivory tower. But to re-emphasize, I chose this image because it's one that I was using when I was working on making solar work for rental properties back in 2016. And at the time, I had a graph to go with it, which I'll spare you, but it just shows how much electricity prices have been increasing at a hyperinflated rate over CPI, over inflation. And that's only continued since 2016, unfortunately, and only at an accelerated rate. And the most important thing that Deb also mentioned is that these things are like, even inflation is increasing at a far, far greater rate than wage growth. So we kind of have this ever worsening inequality. Then kind of getting into the particulars of the electricity system. And I'll mention here that I will, in this presentation, the essay was called A Basic Energy Right, and I sometimes use energy throughout these slides, I'm really talking about electricity now, because I think we're going to get off gas in a residential space quite quickly. And so the emphasis here is going to be on electricity. So there are four kind of peculiarities, I would say, about the electricity market that I want to canvass. The first of which is the fixation on the supply side rather than the demand side, where you use electricity. Particular oddities around the electricity market and how it's designed. Then the influence of customer energy resources, the things we used to call distributed energy resources. And last but no means least, just emphasize the real value of variability. And so that actually motivates a certain level of seeking efficiency in kind of harnessing and managing that variability. So on the supply side, it's really just seems to have dominated our discourse around energy. It's about giving people at a kind of federal level, giving them bill relief. In my own personal career, I've worked on the supply side of trying to get solar to be more accessible to rental properties and to apartments. But I've really come to shift my thinking of that and to see the supply side as being this basically nationally interconnected system, which is so aggregated that the way that we set prices and distribute costs is really incredibly abstract and incredibly arbitrary. With a wave of the policy wand, we can just say that like Bjorn will pay for like all of the ACT's distribution network. Why not? So I think there's so much that can be done on the policy side and kind of abstractly to solve the supply side issues and how they're distributed or the costs are distributed. But the demand side, which is again where VCOSS's project, this one, the Energy Health Nexus project, and lots of great work around the country is focusing, is really inescapably localized. Particularly the household, and particularly if you're in an apartment, there are so many concrete challenges, by which I mean kind of the building infrastructure challenges that are very resistant or very difficult for the policy one to enact, and are not the redistribution of those is not far from trivial. Then on the kind of electricity market itself, now Ron Ben David from Monash has kind of produced a great body of work, one of which I've linked to here. But he's really emphasizing how the electricity market is not a natural market. It didn't arise from people having the desire to congregate and exchange fish for grains. It's an artificial market whose rules are entirely determined by the policy want, by legislation and words on paper. And so any failures that occur of the electricity market are not market failures, they're market design failures. And another really important element of this kind of arbitrary and artificial market is that you don't have a way to exit that market as a consumer. The importance of electricity and underpinning all of our quality of life these days is just so foundational, and that's something that I'm really trying to emphasize here, that much like health, and that's where the VCOSS project is so great. Electricity and health, or electricity is so foundational to health, being able to cook well, keep your food well, keep your medicines cool, keep your bodies or your houses at a safe temperature. So you have this artificial market with barriers to entry, barriers to exit, and that really inhibits the kind of normal functioning of the markets. And it kind of leads to, long story short, through this process of complexification, where the electricity market was initially seen as something that consumers just took. It was kind of, electricity came from coal-fired power stations, and everyone just kind of paid kind of for that. To then, with the privatization and particularly competition in retailing, their consumers were then framed as shoppers who are somehow motivated to shop around for the best deal. And nowadays we're complexifying it further to this kind of conception of each individual household as an energy trader who is able to manage the risks and understand their actions and compete so well that they are able to compete against the large energy companies who are also playing in that market. So I highly recommend reading some of Ron's work. He's also in Melbourne. Then on the customer energy resources front, this is often a kind of controversial one in the industry of whether how much CER are a force for kind of equality and how much they are perturbing or exacerbating inequality. So I would put up that one of my issues with CER, and not to say that we shouldn't be putting solar in our roofs and getting electric vehicles and connecting those to the grid, absolutely. But I think the way that it has been done has really emphasized the individual nature of each household and kind of made everyone into this like atomized prosumer electricity trader at the cost of seeing the collectivist investment in the electricity system and the collectivist outcomes that we want from the electricity system, or we want it to be something that supports everyone in society meeting their basic needs. It furthermore undoubtedly enmeshes privileges, financial, energy literacy, your housing situation. And there is this long touted concept of the death spiral for networks, both gas and electricity, where you have less people paying for their upkeep because they have their own resources. And this, I think, initially was caricatured or imagined as people physically disconnecting from the network, and you're going to get that in the gas network. But even in the electricity system where people are not disconnecting, you still, by virtue of the way that tariffs are currently structured, people with solar are contributing less and less to the costs of the upkeep of the electricity grid, even though they're using that grid to export their own solar power for some perhaps modest revenue, and also that they are relying on that grid for power when they don't have their own generation. So I would argue that even if you use electricity from the grid, say 20% of the year, that 20%, like you would still, that electricity supply is not, you wouldn't value that at 120, a fifth, at 20% of the price that you would normally have paid for your grid connection. because if that happens to be on a really hot day, on a cloudy afternoon, etc., you still really want your fridge and your air conditioning to work then. I think it would be totally reasonable to pay the same. And then lastly, given that what I'm paid to do at ANU is really focusing on the grid integration of clean technologies, particularly storage, stationary, and in electric vehicles, and then generation of renewables, it is really always in the forefront of my mind that we have variability, a lot of variability in our electricity system, but it's actually the coincidence of demand that drives all of the big costs. It drives all of the costs of building our distribution and our transmission network. It also drives high peak prices on the generation side. And so the value of flexibility is actually extremely high, and it's only getting greater as we move to a more and more renewables powered system. And so there's a huge value there in that flexibility, which is what the market is trying to access in some kind of odd ways. And I would also say that there's a huge opportunity for that to succeed, and it is again growing with particularly the uptake of electric vehicles. All right, so that's a very, very quick rundown of what I see as the problem of energy inequality and some of the features of that. Now the real kind of guts of what I wanted to present are around a particular proposal, maybe a couple of proposals, depending on how you see it, around how we can use two distinct policy instruments to achieve these two distinct goals of efficiency and equity. So just to include one quote that I had in the essay, because I really just think it's so fantastic, it is that the alternative to black and white isn't necessarily grey. It might be orange. And I'm going to run with that color theme a bit in these slides. So the proposal is essentially to split the supply of electricity conceptually into the supply of essential electricity, this kind of a basic energy right that everyone in the country has, separate that essential energy from the flexible, elastic uses of electricity. And so that's to me the proposal, and then you use a different mechanism, a different policy to achieve each of those. So the two goals are, the equitable supply of essential energy, where the goals are to moderate the costs. We can't drive it to zero, but we can moderate that cost. Particularly, we can minimize volatility. This is something that my social research colleagues really always highlight as being even more painful than the increase in cost, is the uncertainty and the volatility of that increase. And work on more equitably distributing the costs and benefits of supplying that essential energy. And I put the asterisks on all of these to say that you can't have it all. We're like prioritizing and choosing here. And this is a choice, a design choice. And we may choose this, and we may accept a certain cost in terms of overall efficiency. That to me would be entirely acceptable. I'm not saying it wouldn't necessarily even occur, but if it were to occur, that would be totally acceptable. Then, in terms of the flexible uses of electricity, here we then really can go hell for leather in terms of efficiency. And by maximizing asset utilization of our poles and wires, of our generation systems, of our storage systems, we can reduce overall costs and also reduce carbon emissions. So then to achieve these two goals, I think the essential energy component needs to be achieved through a non-market mechanism. That's like absolutely priority number one. I feel it needs to be not-for-profit and government-led. And at the point here that it needs to be human-readable, which is perhaps a poor phrasing, but it complements or contrasts the machine-readable language that we use in engineering. I mean simple, comprehensible, understandable, pretty intuitive for humans, customers to understand. And then on the other side again, in terms of the flexible energy resources, here we can apply a market. We can create a really actually functional market, counter the one we currently have, that has quote unquote perfect competition, that has free innovation, and where commercial incentives lead and drive those innovations and market offerings. And this can be largely functioning at a machine readable level. So automated or price signals going to machines, to electric vehicles, to batteries, to solar systems, telling them perhaps not what to do, but giving them a price against which to make their decisions. Then in terms of the instruments in greater detail, let's think, well, how do we do that? We need to consider both the how we manage costs of the networks, the transmission and distribution networks, and how we manage the market for electricity generation. So in terms of networks, I would advocate that this might be an idea from Ron's. If it is, all credit to him. If not, apologies. That we could be basing our cost recovery for the existence and upkeep of the electricity networks based on some sort of wealth pegged or wealth-based fee. So one example would be to base your fee that you pay for connection to the electricity system, would base that on the value of the land that you own. This is, I think, kind of equitable and progressive. And it is also consistent with the fact that the value, like I was trying to explain before, the value that you get from accessing the electricity system is, I would say, more akin to the having that access rather than the amount of energy that you use, the kind of per kilowatt hour metrics that we currently use. And also the costs of maintaining the electricity system and expanding it significantly in the future decade is not based on how much you use. It's really based on when you use it, and the coincidence of your usage, or the coincidence of everyone's usage to drive kind of peaks, like your electricity network, is all about the peak rating of the wires at the substations and everything upstream. Then, so that would cover a large part of the cost recovery of the networks. And then some other part of the cost recovery would come from a flexibility market, where that market, again, can operate really for efficiency. There are lots of these existing schemes that we have, ranging from demand response schemes, dynamic operating envelopes, something we work at a lot at ANU, dynamic network prices. Again, there are projects underway that we're contributing towards now. But having these things operate for influencing how and when electric vehicles charge, not trying to influence when families cook dinner. This is the fact that we're just using one price signal to address all customers and these very, very different uses of electricity, from keeping your food cold to discharging a home battery. To me, it's just very, very odd. So then in terms of generation, this one kind of I've thought a lot about, in that we want to continue using a market for price discovery of which different generators are best suited to producing power at any moment in time. So should we be using expensive gas, or should we be using very cheap solar because it's available at a certain moment? That question is, I think, very well managed by a market. And so you still want to have, there will be a variable cost of electricity throughout the day. But how do we shield and insulate customers from that in some appropriate manner? And so the proposal here is that the essential energy, again, we're going to split the essential energy that people need from the flexible uses of electricity. And those essential uses should be managed by a not-for-profit retailer, would have a relatively flat-ish kind of tariff, not penalising people exorbitantly for cooking dinner at 6 p.m, 7 p.m, rather than at 3 a.m. And I think a kicker that would really do a lot against the troubles of the current market is for the retailer to order, if they're going to offer multiple different tariff structures, for them to automatically put customers on the tariff that's best for them based on the data that the retailer has. This runs counter to very much what's happening currently, where even in I forget, AER, AEMC's research shows that the vast majority of customers are not on the best tariff that they could be on. And so again, the idea of the essential energy component is to respect that this electricity use is not an elastic thing to be played with, but instead is an essential service that people deserve. Then on the flexibility market, this would be the market that resources such as electric vehicles, home batteries, hot water systems, etc., rooftop solar systems would be operating in. And I just want to emphasize that that's not kind of a niche or a kind of unviable market, kind of just a small amount of energy. Electric vehicles and hot water systems together will represent like over 50% of household electricity consumption. So it's still a huge market there to be commercially viable and to have the impact that we want in terms of efficiency, in terms of shifting when demand is on the grid and when demand is on generators. And the incentive for connecting your vehicles into this market is that the cost ought to be lower than the essential energy component, and/or one can always mandate such things. Now, this really brings it home to me. Kind of everything that I've said to here is pretty abstract, but I think there's a real opportunity to implement this in terms of the Snowy Hydro system and the Snowy Hydro company, and really using that, converting that into the battery of the people. So why I think that's appropriate is that it's currently 100% government-owned entity, federal government, only one owner, federal government, although 2 ministers are responsible for it. Now, it already has 2 retailers that have over 10,000 customers. So they kind of have the systems in place for doing retailing. They could, again, at the wave of a policy wand, be told to be not-for-profit retailers, put people on the best tariffs available. And the thing that triggered this all is that the biggest risk, or the biggest risk and thing that kind of makes energy retailing difficult, and is the reason that they exist, is to manage the risks, manage the volatility of the electricity market. And as an operator primarily of storage assets, pumped hydro in the Snowy is so well positioned to manage that volatility. That's their absolute core business. And so when prices are high, Snowy's profits are high. And so they would naturally be able to insulate their customers from that at no loss, no financial loss to themselves. In terms of the flexibility markets, kind of the wholesale market, Snowy could continue to operate as they do currently, being a very, very powerful price setter in the market, and they can continue to do that. That's fine. Although I might wish to then ring fence them all out of being the retailer or the aggregator for customer energy resources or customer flexibility devices. The other thing, actually, I think I'll talk about it in the politics section. The kind of way that a lot of my thinking here has started was around the idea of a universal basic income for energy. That's what triggered the essay, and there is phrased as a basic energy right. Here's the universal basic energy. Haven't really landed on a really perfect name for it. But I want to position this here as an optional extra. I think everything that I've talked about before, we could do, and is perhaps even a little bit closer to the Overton window than universal basic income for energy. But I want to put it out here as still, I think it would be a desirable optional extra in my view. And the idea here would be to have some of this essential energy component be provided to every household free of charge. You then kind of get into the weeds of, well, how much energy, how do you kind of, which energy is it, the energy that you use at kind of 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. where no one really wants to be doing their cooking, or is it at peak hours? So it all gets a little bit complicated, which would be fun and worthwhile to work through. I would again emphasize that there's an opportunity to link it in with Snowy Hydro to say, okay, it's going to be the most expensive 4 kilowatt hours of each day, and that'll be covered by Snowy. Because if it's really expensive, Snowy will be generating, so they're not going to be at a financial loss for providing that. There are a great number of ways that one could fund this. They're detailed in the essay, but it would be challenging to kind of integrate it with competition in retailing and having multiple retailers. Now, if there was one kind of primary not-for-profit retailer, perhaps that would be easier. I might, in the interest of time, skip over these. We can share the slides now. And then in the last section, just wanted to talk about some of the headwinds and tailwinds for some sort of proposals along these lines. So again, very much speaking outside of my area of expertise, but what I see as the real headwinds for progress on energy equity in general is that there is a really entrenched ideology around electricity being a market. No one ever talks, well, I try to, but it's generally not talked about the electricity system or the electricity grid. We always talk about the national electricity market. It's the AEMC, it's the AEMO, the market operator. Then additionally to that kind of abstract ideological opposition, the energy system is very lucrative, and the NEM is a very lucrative place to be. So there are strong vested interests in continuing that to be the case. And then at a psychological level, anything that has to do with inequality and redressing inequality means you're redistributing resources and rights, which unavoidably means you're taking from someone. So someone's going to lose out in this, and that needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be argued why that is appropriate and why it is still in the collective overall good to have a more equitable system, rather than extorting poor and vulnerable people through these very high prices and volatile prices. On the other hand, there are quite a few kind of signs of change that I see around that will be supportive of addressing inequality, and perhaps even supportive of the proposals, the kind of the ways in which I've proposed that could be done. We're seeing much stronger government leadership in the energy system that seems to kind of have a long history in the energy system of kind of inequality, and prices get so out of control that ultimately kind of governments need to step in. And there's a line of thought that say they need to step in before prices get so high, before like the political threshold for action is lower than the market threshold for investment. And so governments need to step in first before you would have such high prices for such a long period of time that you'd see a mass investment from the markets. So we're seeing this government leadership in the kind of reformation of the the State Electricity Commission in Victoria, and also federally in the Capacity Investment Scheme. Very recently, there's been a review kicked off for the NEM, very much formulated around the NEM, the market, but perhaps there could be scope there. And then just to like really put Snowy under the microscope again, Snowy made a profit touch under $900 million last financial year. And I believe because they're owned by the federal government and they have two shareholder ministers, but I believe their statement of expectations, which is the document that directs how the company should be run and in what purposes, is currently under review. And so again, the wave of a magical policy wand, you just add the words in there, thou shalt be a non-for-profit retailer for the people. Happy days, we would have such a tremendous improvement in energy equity, is my belief. So to summarize, so we have some time for others. Now, inequality is a systemic, kind of society-wide problem, but that hurts people's and in the electricity system that really punishes and hurts the most vulnerable. They're the ones who are most likely to go to bed at 4 p.m. because they can't afford the heaters, whereas those who have more wealth are just going to pay the high prices and continue to heat and cool their houses. And I think critically, because we are going through a major transition in the electricity system that is going to involve digitization, it becoming more distributed, and decarbonised, the existence and the worsening of inequality really exacerbates the mistrust that society has in the electricity system today, and in all of us who work in the electricity system, in our actions to proceed and progress that transition in a way that reflects what people want. I then propose that to have reached two policy goals of an efficient system and an equitable one, we need two policy instruments, which I basically suggest is to split the supply of electricity as an essential energy component and a flexible energy or electricity component, and to manage the essential component with the non-market mechanisms, particularly being government-led and not-for-profit, while we really try and harness the efficiency and the flexibility. So we really try and harness the flexibility of new digital technologies, particularly electric vehicles and other storage, batteries and storage technologies, in a way to deliver efficiency to the market by managing and thereby reducing the amount of peak loads on the network, the amount of network that we need to build, the amount of new generation and storage that we need to build. And just for argument's sake, I propose that there's a real opportunity for Snowy Hydro to be a vehicle to progress this. And then summarize that the political moment does actually provide a few quite promising signs for the opportunities for change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. That was just such an excellent presentation. And I know that there's been a lot of comments in the chat, as well as questions coming through. So much to think about. And I feel like we could spend days, if not weeks, with you just deep diving into each of these elements that you've raised, these kind of provocations and ideas and proposals. We're going to go to Q&A shortly, but in the meantime, it's my pleasure to introduce Rory Anderson. Rory is the Energy Policy Advisor at VCOSS, although I think he probably feels like he wears multiple hats. He works on many other policy issues as well, but energy is his absolute kind of passion and area of kind of deep expertise. So I'm very pleased to welcome Rory to speak with you about Rory's thoughts on energy as a basic right. Thank you, Rory.
Thank you, Deb. Great presentation from Beyond there. I just want to take us through some of the policy implications of energy as a basic right and talk about mobilising coalitions for change to establish that right. But first, I will give some context for energy in Victoria. So as you've sort of heard from Bjorn already, the energy system we currently have is really unfair. In Victoria, our gas and electricity systems are fully privatised. It is a highly regulated market. This still means, though, that the supply of an essential service is subject to market forces. As we've already heard, some of market failure, market complexity, poor planning, economic forces around the world, price gouging, these all combine to create what I'd call structural unaffordability. And the market, it really doesn't do a very good job of supporting people who are struggling. During the financial year 2023-24 in Victoria, over 69,000 electricity and 62,000 gas customers were receiving tailored assistance from their energy retailer, that on average every month. That usually means payment plans for debt. In that time, only 22% of electricity and 21% of gas customers exited that assistance with no outstanding debt remaining. People in energy hardship usually have other intersecting hardships as well, and are usually forced to make really tough decisions between paying bills, affording medicine, food, or other essentials. And our energy market, it exists in a time of profound change, with renewables upsetting the dominance of fossil fuels, electricity grids becoming decentralized, rooftop solar and batteries changing the way energy is generated and shared. Obviously, these are all necessary changes to mitigate and adapt to climate change and to eliminate the health impacts of burning fossil fuels, but the costs are currently being shared unfairly. And access to home energy upgrades or more efficient electric appliances, upgrades that could reduce household costs, improve health, reduce emissions, is extremely limited for the people that the community sector represents due to high upfront costs. This sort of further exacerbates the inequality that already exists in the energy market. And much of the energy policy debate that happens today looks at these problems within the existing structures, as in through a privatized energy market. Businesses, regulators talk about these complex time of use tariffs, virtual power plants, and other market-based innovations. But many market solutions, if you delve into it, involve further switching economic risk from big companies onto consumers themselves. So through our work at VCOSS on the Energy Health Nexus project, we've started looking at different approaches for tackling energy hardship and the transition to renewable energy for all. And that's where we came at the notion that access to clean and renewable energy should be enshrined as a basic right. Energy obviously is something you can't live without in a modern society. It's reflected in Goal 7 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals: ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all. In a provocation paper released as part of the Energy and Health Nexus project, our final provocation was a call to address the structural drivers of energy hardship by enacting a right to clean and affordable energy. So we might go through here what that might look in practice to complement what Bjorn was sharing with us earlier. Obviously, there's no currently agreed upon framework for what an energy right might look like. So this is just some examples of what you might see in a complex kind of framework to deliver it. You might look at a policy banning disconnections and putting a maximum cap on how much energy debt a person can accrue to ensure continued access and protect customers from racking up really high debt. Removing unreasonably priced energy offers from the market, such as legacy offers that are priced above the Victorian default offer, for example, would improve affordability. And enacting things like a regulated duty of care on retailers within consumer protections would improve support for those who are struggling. And very important, increasing access to energy information and advocacy services, many delivered by the community sector, such as the Energy Assistance Program and financial counselling services, would really help consumers to navigate what is a really complex market. As we're talking about clean energy as well, we'll need more financial supports for low-income households to get off fossil gas, improve energy efficiency and access things like solar and batteries, and minimum standards to ensure that renters also have access to these benefits. And finally, you can change how energy is priced, of course, to create affordability. One of many examples is a social tariff, a special low price for specific cohorts. And as you've already heard from Bjorn, a really interesting and exciting idea in terms of equity implications, splitting off essential use of energy and pricing it differently, or maybe even providing it entirely for free. So these policies taken together would be a huge shake-up of the privatized energy market and its regulatory frameworks. So sort of begs the question, how realistic is our prospect of success in enacting something like this? Bjorn gave a great example of like the Overton window and where these things sit. There is plenty of precedent for change, I think. Firstly, in their sort of long history, energy markets have always been in flux. They're always continually changing. The grid that exists now looks radically different from what existed only a few decades ago. In terms of improving households at that level, many jurisdictions already have significant energy retrofit programs. A great example is the Healthy Homes program in New Zealand, which has seen upgrades lead to significantly reduced hospitalizations due to energy hardship. In Australia, obviously we all know rooftop solar has been a huge success in terms of the scale of what's been rolled out, although of course energy access to things like solar and energy upgrades for low-income households and renters remains a really big challenge. And then energy pricing, it might seem like a sacred cow, but legislation enacted in California this year, for example, rolled out basically a version of a social tariff whereby network charges, at least for low-income households and customers living in affordable housing, were kept to a low flat rate. And then in Victoria, the government's revival of the State Electricity Commission is obviously at least a nod to popular dissatisfaction with the privatised market and its failures. But I think for us as advocates in VCOSS, regardless of the policies, speaking about energy as a right really allows energy consumer advocates to frame our advocacy in terms of social and economic justice rather than arguing the point on the grounds of economic efficiency, which is what structures in our current market always push us to do. This shift is much the same as speaking about housing or healthcare as a right, not a privilege. And we really actually see treating energy as a right as complementing those calls. So how would we actually get there? I think achieving energy as a right won't be easy. It would require a big shake-up of norms that many people are very used to, including many of the advocates that I personally work with. It also impacts multiple ministerial portfolios, from energy to housing, government services. So to tackle this challenge, our ambition is to form broad cross-sectoral coalitions to push for change. And this is where our thinking from the Energy Health Nexus project really comes into play. By examining how two systems, the energy and health system, interact, by finding where common ground exists to work from, making links, charting a way forward. And as well as, energy advocates, the community sector, a coalition could also include health organisations, trade unions, anti-poverty groups, social housing providers, all uniting around campaigns both publicly and privately, inside track for policies that build up a right to energy. And this coalition would also work to educate communities about their rights by building up a network of trusted voices. This is not actually a new idea by any means. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. For example, housing as a right is already a well-established advocacy framing among housing advocates. And in Europe, there are plenty of exciting examples of coalitions coming together around the call for energy as a right, such as the Right to Energy Coalition, which works across the European Union. There's the Catalan Energy Poverty Alliance in Spain, and the Fuel Poverty Action UK. So in summary, stable and affordable energy is really a core ingredient to a good life. It's a basic standard of life in a modern society. And our transition to clean and renewable energy sources really has to be fair and equitable. And we really don't want to see that transition lock in existing inequalities. So working on the energy and health hardship nexus has led us to conclude that it is time to recognise clean and affordable energy as a basic right. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I know we're running short on time, so I'm not going to editorialise. I'm going to get straight into questions. Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much, Bjorn. To try and get through as many questions as we can, let's try and be both have some depth, but also try and be succinct as well. There's so much here to talk about. The first question is and Bjorn, I think this is one to start with you. The idea of essential versus flexible energy is helpful, but in practice, how and who decides what is essential versus what is flexible?
Yeah, I'm going to guess that's Ron and David.
Yes.
So I think there's this has been kind of played with and toyed around in various forms before. But I think there is, and it's kind of particularly air conditioning is a particularly contentious one. But I think what motivates me is I do a lot of research on electric vehicles. The amount of energy, the amount of electricity that electric vehicles are going to consume in the near future is tremendous. And I would argue quite flexible. So if we just start there, and with home hot water systems, we have, I think, already a very, very large and viable kind of pool of energy to work with. And then everything else as a starting point could just be essential.
Thank you so much. And there was kind of just there's a few more layers to that question as well, but just kind of recognising that what's essential on one day may be flexible on another day. So depending on household circumstances, weather conditions, etc. So I'm not sure, Bjorn, whether you want to comment on anything else in terms of how we would potentially kind of like manage that fluidity between essentiality versus flexibility under the proposed approach.
Yeah, again, I just think hot water and electric vehicles are going to be flexible the vast majority of the time. And then you always provide every household or consumer with the option to override that kind of within reason.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question is if we're pegging a model on one provider or source, Snowy Hydro being the example, doesn't that limit the model if it goes down, etc.?
I don't understand how it's going to go down. I think I'm kind of advocating that Snowy continues to act in the wholesale markets as per usual, which is a very, very like commercially driven way that they act. They do a lot of price setting, and I'm just advocating that on that volatility and kind of market revenue gets shielded, like customers get shielded from that. So their retail offering is very kind of either not for profit or flattish, very kind of enacting the what Rory also mentioned, kind of the rights of customers within that.
Yeah, thank you. Bjorn, you've talked a lot in your presentation as well about political will and about political moments. There's a question here. So I guess thinking about what Rory's discussed in his presentation about, what VCOSS is, wanting to do and others are wanting to do in terms of building kind of cross-sectoral collaborations to, I guess, help persuade governments to use the levers at their disposal in terms of, a policy agenda, in terms of legislation, in terms of their ability to kind of affect regulatory settings and kind of, adopt this kind of shift to, energy as a basic right. As a paradigm shift, how does this model benefit energy providers if it's a government agenda? Is the question.
So it wouldn't be to the benefit of electricity. It would be at the cost of electricity retailers. They would be the ones losing out from this. Because networks have kind of a huge sunk cost, something like $25 billion worth of Australian money has gone into building those over the decades. I'm not suggesting that we stop paying for them. I'm just advocating that we redistribute that cost in a different manner. Generators will continue to operate and sell into a wholesale market that is run by AEMO with kind of efficient dispatch of units. And that price can be volatile. It can even become more volatile if that's an efficient thing to do. And then that cost will flow on to many electricity users, industry, governments, and to flexible resources such as electric vehicles. But just that a part of the electricity supply is carved out for essential uses for homes, essentially. And then probably there would be less, if one had a not-for-profit government retailer, I would imagine that would be quite popular. And that would reduce the amount of customers going with other retailers. So that they would be the ones losing out. But they wouldn't lose out entirely because they could then focus, they would perhaps be alleviated of some of their hardship programs and responsibilities and could then really try and innovate on addressing and creating new services for that flexible market of electric vehicles, which again is like half of households worth of electricity just in an electric vehicle and hot water.
Sure, thank you. So a range of kind of different ideas and questions coming through. One of the questions is, should energy bills be priced more progressively with a social tariff for lower incomes paid for with high prices for those who can afford to pay?
Yeah, Rory?
Yeah, I think that's the sort of central thesis to what we're saying, that costs are currently shared unfairly and that we would like to see mechanisms put in place to make that more progressive. A social tariff is one of the policy ideas that's out there.
Great, thank you. Bjorn, in terms of setting up your presentation this morning as well, you talked about kind of the complexity and failures of the current market. And you also talked about the fact that so many of the things that we're discussing today are abstract for consumers. So energy hardship is not an abstract concept to consumers, but the types of conversations that we're having are thinking about that idea of universal basic energy. You pointed to some of the policy design and implementation kind of questions that would need to be landed. Do you have any thoughts on how we could kind of like democratise these types of conversations so that consumers who find it really hard to navigate the market and participate in these conversations, how do we democratise these conversations so that consumers are part of like the co-design of some of these kind of policy solutions?
Yeah, I think there is a great literature and practice around co-design and responsible innovation working through organisations like VCOSS, Energy Consumers Australia, others. I think that like politically, I just get the sense that like people are broadly unsatisfied with the current privatised electricity system, and kind of tweaking within that, even while I totally support a social tariff, it kind of strikes me as complex, and I wouldn't know as a consumer whether that really is doing much for me or not, or who it's doing something for or not, which is where my motivation for kind of a much more stark, bold, perhaps simple and intuitive proposal, I think might actually have a lot more political carriage.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Now, I'm conscious of time. We've already run over at 12:01. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for more questions today, but I guess I did want to send a message that this is the first of many conversations that VCOSS is keen to be hosting, facilitating, convening. We will be having more of these webinars, but there's a whole body of work that will kind of continue to follow over the next year through this project that we have funded through Energy Consumers Australia. So just wanted to say thank you so much for all of the audience for making yourself available today. Thanks for your interest and engagement with this. Thank you to Bjorn as our guest presenter as well. Thank you to Rory from the VCOSS team. Look out for more webinars, as I said, as part of the Energy Health Nexus series in the new year. There is an evaluation form that's just popped up in the chat. So really want to be responsive to your feedback about how you found this session, future conversations that you might want to be possible, that you might want to be part of in future. So please just complete that evaluation form if you can, that's just popped up in the chat. And we will be back in touch with a recording of this webinar. If there's some questions that we didn't get to, we'll take those on notice and we'll look at kind of distributing answers to those questions out of session as we kind of share the resources post-event. But I want to say thanks again to Bjorn, thanks again to Rory, thanks to Energy Consumers Australia for funding this project, thanks to all participants, and thank you to the VCOSS team, to Emma Halloran, our project coordinator for the Energy Health Nexus project, who's the brains behind this event today and behind the project. And thank you to our communications team, including Amy Houston, who's just returned to from parental leave, and this is her first event back from a year's leave. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to continued conversations with you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.